Yo, what is up, guys? Today we're going to be comparing Sinner versus Alcaraz's forehand. It's the US Open Finals today, and they're playing each other, so I thought this would be a perfect time to analyze and compare their forehands. They both have amazing forehands in their own rights. They're both slightly different, but they also share some key principles, which I want to discuss today. So let's get started. The first thing we can notice is Sinner has already separated his left hand from the racket a little bit earlier than Alcaraz. So Alcaraz probably keeps his left hand on the racket the longest out of any other player on tour. It's similar to Djokovic, so this really helps him get disguise and a lot of coiling during his backswing. So he doesn't release his left hand until it gets past his dominant hitting shoulder. Alcaraz's left hand is a little bit angled more upwards, whereas Sinner's is more just flat horizontal. So Sinner's left hand is a little bit more like this, where his forearm is kind of parallel to the ground almost, and his palm is more facing down towards the ground, whereas Alcaraz is a little bit more like this. So his palm is a bit more facing up, so he's a little bit more supinated, and a little bit more externally rotated, like this. Boom, external rotation. And Alcaraz also has a higher preparation. So notice how Alcaraz's hitting hand is around his chin level. It's above his hitting shoulder. Whereas we can look at Jannik Sinner, his hitting hand is closer to around his chest level. Now, we've seen other players that have really big takebacks where their hand goes like above their head even, like Shapovalov and Zverev, which I think is too much. So there's an optimal point, there's a balance, and I think Alcaraz and Djokovic meet that balance quite well, because by having your hand a bit higher up, you got to use more gravity, but you don't want to have your hand too high up, otherwise it's just unnecessary. So the only critique I could possibly give Sinner's forehand is I think if he just set up a little bit higher, he would get even more power. Now, I think his compact setup will help him definitely for incoming fast balls. You can notice that at this point, both their rackets tilt quite severely forwards to the net. So I asked AI, what's the purpose of tilting the racket forward to the net on the forehand preparation? Because they're both doing a little bit of radial deviation of their wrist to accomplish this. And the purpose of this is to preload the wrist. This lets the racket naturally drop into the lag position as the body rotates, creating a whip-like effect for more racket head speed. It also helps with spin production. The forward tilt of the racket helps position the string so that as the racket comes up and forward, the swing path brushes up the back of the ball, making it easier to generate consistent topspin. It also helps with elastic energy storage, so the wrist and forearm muscles are being stretched when the racket is tilted forward. And then on the forward swing, the stored elastic energy releases, adding more power to the stroke. And then it's more efficient biomechanics. Radial deviation, where the wrist bends towards the thumb side during preparation, allows for a smooth transition into ulnar deviation, where the wrist bends towards the pinky side during contact. So right now, they're radial deviated because their rackets are pointing towards their thumb. And now here, as they drop into their forward swing, their wrists now go into ulnar deviation, where the wrists are pointing towards their pinky side. Okay, next we can note that Alcaraz has a larger take back in terms of the y-axis, so he maintains a taller backswing. We can see his hitting hand is still relatively close to the height of his right shoulder, and here's the crucial difference. Notice how Sinner's strings are pointing towards the back fence, whereas Alcaraz's strings are pointing right towards us. So this is due to a combination of both grip differences, where Alcaraz is a little bit more Eastern and Sinner is a little bit more Western. And also Sinner is intentionally pronating a lot more, which is causing his racket to face more towards the back fence. We can also see that Alcaraz's bracket stays above his hitting hand, whereas Sinner's racket is around the same height as his hitting hand at this position. So Alcaraz tends to hold his racket here a little bit longer, and then from here, he goes like this, and then he just drops right into contact. Whereas Sinner will be more like this, and like Djokovic, he'll be kind of waiting back here a little bit longer. So he's not waiting up here as much. He's more back here. And I feel like this racket position where it's horizontal really helps him get a lot of racket head flip. And while a lot of the other elite forehands have their strings facing down towards the ground at this point, we can notice that Sinner, his strings are even more pronated than most other players. So instead of his strings facing the ground, it's actually tilted back towards the fence. And Alcaraz, on the other hand, he has kind of a separate difference where his strings are somewhat pointing towards the ground, but it's not fully pronated. So he doesn't fully pronate. He probably pronates to around 60 degrees. But he's still somewhat pronated, which is very important. This is the one thing where I think if Alcaraz could improve anything with his forehand, it would be this. It would just be pronating a little bit more. But other than that, I think his forehand is perfect. And another big difference is that Alcaraz drops seamlessly into his forward swing. So there's a seamless, continuous motion from backswing to forward swing. Whereas Sinner, like Djokovic, has just a very slight pause here at the back before swinging forward. So he kind of sets up back here and then he swings forward. Whereas Alcaraz kind of holds his racket longer in this phase and then drops just straight into contact. So he's really using the momentum from gravity to just go right into contact. So that's a big difference there. Another similarity is just look at their lower body. I mean, it looks almost identical. They're both stepping with their right foot to do an open stance forehand. And look at their knees. They're both internally rotated with their hips because their knees are pointed inwards. And the purpose of this right hip internal rotation is to load the kinetic chain. So when you coil in the open stance and the right hip is internally rotated, this stores rotational energy in the hip joint and glutes, like twisting a spring. And it creates separation or torque. The hips internally rotate while the torso and shoulders stay coiled back a little bit longer. And this is what's famously referred to as hip-shoulder separation, which is essential for generating racket head speed. And now we can see here at the end of their backswing, Alcaraz's arm is completely straight, whereas Sinner's arm is slightly bent, but it's mostly straight. But then watch how as they start swinging forward into contact, the difference in their arm straightness magnifies. So Alcaraz maintains the straight arm, whereas Sinner starts to bend, like Djokovic. As to which one I think is optimal, I do think whatever looks more aesthetic is more optimal because aesthetics and function are tied close together. So I do think a straight arm is preferable. But as we've seen with Djokovic and Sinner, it's not a big deal if you have a bent arm. So again, at this point, notice the difference in the level of pronation and supination. Alcaraz is more supinated. Sinner is pronated at this point, petting the dog. And then as they swing forward, they both supinate their arms. We can tell that because we can see the racket strings more as they start swinging forward. So right now we can't see Sinner's strings, but now we can see them. They both do a lot of external rotation at this point from here to here. And I've done lots of videos on what that is. And one of the differences, Alcaraz really maintains a line between his shoulder to shoulder and his hitting arm. So watch how it's almost like a perfect, you could draw a perfectly straight line from his shoulders to his hitting arm as he's hitting through up until right before contact. Even here, he maintains it. Whereas Sinner doesn't quite do that as much. So see how his hitting arm is a little bit in front of his hitting shoulders. Now, I think the way that Alcaraz is doing it is ideal. So this is one thing Sinner could improve just a little bit. But Sinner still does a great job of leading with his torso and uncoiling his left side. See how by this point, his chest and stomach is already facing the net? Alcaraz is just a little bit more aggressive in that regard. So at this point, they're a few frames away from contact. The racket's below their hand, which will help them get adequate topspin. And as they go into contact, notice how their racket now becomes more level. It becomes closer to ground level. And then we can obviously see that Alcaraz's hitting arm is completely straight. He looks like Federer and Nadal, whereas Sinner looks a bit more like Djokovic. But what's important to note is that Sinner, even though he has a bent arm, he doesn't look cramped or jammed, right? If you look at a lot of beginning players that have bent arms, their rackets are like back here, their hitting shoulder isn't far forward, so they just look awkward and jammed. But Sinner never looks like that. So he still does a good job of pushing his hitting side forward through the shot, and Alcaraz does that even more to an extreme. So the key thing I want you to look at is Sinner's upper arm. Notice how it pushes forward. Same with Alcaraz. It's really pushing forward through the shot, and that's what enables him to generate a lot of power and really get his hitting side through the shot. And they both pronate really well from this point onwards. So the racket head is turning over, the strings are facing down towards the ground. And now comes another big difference. One of the key things that separates Sinner's forehand from other people is he has this like whip-like finish. You see that? It's very whip-like. And how he's getting that is his hitting elbow is really coming across his body. It's almost like he's elbowing someone in front of him. Boom. Right there. Whereas Alcaraz, we can notice that his upper arm doesn't come across his body as aggressively. So the timing is slightly different. Whereas Sinner, both his upper and his lower arm are almost coming across his body at the same time. Alcaraz, which is similar to Federer, after he makes contact, notice how his upper arm hasn't moved that much at this point, but it's his lower arm that's moving around. And then now his upper arm starts moving around. So see the difference in timing there? The key difference I'm trying to show is that Sinner really gets his hitting elbow around like this. So he goes like this, and it's almost like he's going like that. Like he's making this motion with his elbow. Whereas Alcaraz, after he makes contact, he's more like, it's more forearm, it's more just forearm dominant. His upper arm doesn't do as much until after his forearm comes around, which is similar to Federer. And then last little difference at the very end is that Sinner's left hand is a little bit in front of him, whereas Alcaraz's left hand gets more out of the way. So I think it's better to do it like Alcaraz is doing. Just get that left side, make sure, especially for beginners, just make sure that left side really gets around. So you can almost see, you can see his left elbow at the end. And then in terms of their finish, Alcaraz is a little bit more like this. So his wrist is a little bit more neutral. Whereas Sinner and Djokovic, for example, are a little bit more like this. So they're a little bit more pronated and radially deviated. So towards the thumb. A little bit more like this, whereas Alcaraz is a bit more like this. Earlier is notice the timing of when their hips start to extend and also come forward. So look at that. It happens right there, right from here to here. So right at the end of their backswing, as they start to swing forward, they're going to start pushing off with that right foot. And their hip is going to extend upwards, and it's also going to start to rotate forwards towards the net, right? So the timing there is important.